Well, so over lunch, we heard the processing of the ideas that you've put up, and begun to see which ones were falling out as key ideas that you wanted to explore further. And since I've really talked with you already about a number of ideas, what I wanted to do is just address an idea or two on some of the key issues that I know you're going to be working on creatively in probably just a few minutes. But the idea of new sources of financing was an issue that was a concern for many of you. And there are really two elements to look at here in terms of new sources of financing. I think one is the public purpose of local food, and I think a lot of the sources of financing we need to be thinking about are ones that are tied to particular public purposes, which may not be the food in and of itself, but it is improving health, reducing obesity, increasing activity among children, education, and so forth. And so in terms of looking at grant sources, I think for production of local food, it really means understanding and tying into these public purposes and potential grant sources that look at some of those. But we can also see funding for local food from sort of a market perspective. When we're thinking about sources, I have to think, one that just comes immediately to mind is, if you think of how the market works, it's not that you necessarily need a subsidy for local food. What you need is to take away subsidies for competing foods that may not be very functional and may not be adding a lot of value and may be costing society quite a lot. And so to think about for industrial agriculture, where there are subsidies that some may be appropriate, some may not be appropriate, and may disadvantage local food and diversity of production and diversity of foods over monocultures too much. And so that means sort of advocacy on a very broad scale, but in some ways bringing market back into line by taking out these distortions in a way to the market. Another market-based piece, as I think about sources of financing, is tourism and economic development, and just the ways particular foods can be tied with place. And it has to do with authenticity of place. People love places, people love cities, and food is a part of that. And there are ways, I believe, to do marketing that really ties food to place. Who among us hasn't traveled France or in the United States for that matter, and gone to a place and learned to associate particular foods with particular places. And so I think those are marketing issues and tourism issues. In terms of the second most important issue in terms of your voting earlier today was coming up with more distribution channels beyond farmers markets. And you can think of a lot of different places, schools and collaborations, cooking schools, hotels, and so forth. But it does occur to me that one of the tools that government uses a lot is tax and sales tax. And government uses sales tax often as a sin tax to keep people from smoking more, drinking more, gambling more, and so forth. But it can also be a tool to remove sales tax to encourage certain kinds of behavior. And to the extent that it may be related to local economic development, there may be justification for removing sales tax for locally grown food. There'd be a lot of costs associated with it, though. How do you track it? How do you make the argument of what it is? But it would be interesting. The third most important issue that you've voted for, I guess, is using or buying land, either privately or publicly owned, and just one quick thought there is that sometimes when government agencies own land, it's very, very difficult for them to get rid of it. For years, the federal government would not, that if a federal agency were to sell land, essentially that agency wouldn't get the money back, it'd go back into general revenues. Now, I don't know, maybe someone else does. Illinois law on government uses, but creating incentives for governmental units to make sort of good, sometimes market-based decisions on when to sell and not to sell. And sometimes that means bringing the proceeds of the sale back to the selling unit so that they have an incentive to think about, is this a wise thing? And of course, sometimes it doesn't make sense to sell. Right-of-ways, for example, need to be held for future uses and so forth, but sometimes it may. The other quick thought in terms of buying or using land, either privately or publicly held, is land is more than just the land. It's everything above and everything below, and most importantly for agriculture is water access. And as planners, we need to be future-oriented and to be thinking about possibility for climate change and what that's going to mean in the Chicago metropolitan region. And there are estimates of water tables dropping tremendously in many areas. And so that means pumping water can be much more difficult and more expensive to do. It also means that there could be additional demands on Lake Michigan water. Well, Lake Michigan water, the water table is expected with global warming to go down, and with the Lake Michigan table going down, there's still also, actually, even if it didn't go down, there's still treaty agreements as to how much water can be taken out by Illinois. And so I think that can be a limit in the long run. And so competing uses make a difference. Water that's used to flush the Chicago River down to the Mississippi, the more we use for that, the less there is for competing uses such as agriculture. And so we need to take a long-term interest in some of those kinds of issues, particularly because a lot of the urban water sources are going to be traditional, are going to be tap water in a lot of cases. In terms of the fourth most important issue was education and making farming an honorable profession, so to speak, and really showing how useful it can be. And just a quick thought there is, one of the ways we help people appreciate good urban planning, Portland has done this, is to put up plaques and to say, oh, did you notice there's no setback here? Notice how this was done? Here's why it was done. And help people learn. And to do the same thing where there are farmers markets and where food is grown, or even where food was grown, to help understand the history of food. In Chicago, growing onions and former roles of places. And it helps people think about possible futures. The fifth most important item that you brought up was sharing information about urban agriculture as an important one. And all I could think is, thank goodness you see that as an important one, because it really is something. It's one of the easier things to do something about in a fragmented government, right? That so many things. You have to fight the battle in every single municipality or special district or wherever it is. And this is something that can be addressed regionally, either through regional organizations like CMAP, which is so good about thinking about ways to educate and assist local governments in dealing with issues, but also nonprofit organizations in advocacy and education. And then finally, the issue that you raised as important was farmer training and certification. And just one quick thought there are extension services. This is really a role that they've traditionally played. And I don't know the degree to which, I guess because I'm with the Chicago campus, and even though with the Illinois system, extension services really technically are all three campuses. They're really more associated with downstate than Southern. I don't know what kind of services they provide, but it seems to me right in line with the kinds of things that you're thinking about. That, you know, we have a land grant institution, and this is supposed to be one of its main priorities, is to think about help the state and help farmers think about agriculture. So hope that helps as you look at next stage.